My neighbor paved my septic access for his RV, owed $16,000. How does a simple paving job end with a $16,000 bill? What really happened between two neighbors over something as ordinary as a septic access and an RV? Stay with me, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you enjoy stories where ordinary disputes take unforgettable turns. Before we get into this one, tell me in the comments, what would you do if a neighbor changed part of your property without asking? It all began on a quiet morning when something looked different the moment I stepped outside, and from that instant, nothing about the days ahead would ever feel quite the same. Some mistakes don't look expensive until the jackhammer shows up. The first crack echoed across the neighborhood just after sunrise. Fresh asphalt shattered into jagged black slabs as a demolition crew carved a path straight through what had been a perfectly smooth RV parking pad only 3 days earlier. Dust floated through the warm summer air while the sharp smell of hot tar mixed with damp soil rising from underneath. A county inspector stood beside a surveyor holding a clipboard. Two sheriff's deputies watched quietly from the curb, not because anyone was in danger, but because court orders have a way of making people suddenly cooperative. My neighbor, Derek Collins, stood frozen beside his 40-foot luxury motorhome with both hands on his hips, staring at the destruction like he couldn't believe it was happening. 3 mornings earlier, he had been grinning for an entirely different reason. I can still remember the confidence in his voice when he looked across the property line and told me, "You'll never need that little patch of ground again." He pointed toward the fresh black pavement beneath his RV as though he had improved my property without expecting so much as a thank you. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply nodded, looked at the newly paved surface, and quietly walked back into my garage. People sometimes mistake silence for surrender. In reality, silence usually means someone is counting facts instead of emotions. As the demolition saw screamed through the asphalt, Derek's expensive parking space disappeared one section at a time. Every cut exposed compacted gravel. Every scoop revealed another layer of earth. Finally, the excavator operator lifted the last broken slab away, uncovering a round green septic access lid that had been buried beneath several inches of asphalt. The inspector bent down, brushed away the remaining dirt with a gloved hand, and checked a document attached to his clipboard. He didn't sound angry. He didn't need to. "Protected maintenance access," he said calmly. "It should never have been covered." Those 7 words carried far more weight than any argument either of us could have made. Derek's face slowly lost its color as another contractor handed him a revised invoice. Asphalt removal, soil restoration, septic inspection, surface reconstruction, engineering verification, legal compliance. The total sat at the bottom of the page in bold numbers. $16,000. The breeze carried the faint smell of diesel from the equipment idling nearby, while fragments of broken pavement tumbled into the dump truck with dull, heavy thuds. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. Justice rarely sounds dramatic. Most of the time, it sounds like paperwork being approved, engines idling, and contractors doing exactly what the law requires. Standing there beside my mailbox, watching workers uncover something my father had carefully built decades earlier, I realized the most expensive lesson Derek would ever learn had nothing to do with asphalt. It was about assuming that empty space belongs to whoever wants it most. 3 days earlier, neither of us knew we'd be standing here. But I knew exactly where this story had truly begun. 3 days earlier, the neighborhood still smelled like freshly cut grass instead of broken asphalt. My name is Ethan Walker, and for the past 17 years I have worked as a civil engineer designing roads, drainage systems, utility corridors, and residential infrastructure across Central Texas. Most people drive over things I help design without giving them a second thought. That is exactly how infrastructure is supposed to work. When everything is built correctly, nobody notices it. My father used to tell me that the strongest things on a property are often the ones buried underground. He built the septic system behind our house himself nearly 30 years ago after spending countless weekends studying county regulations and talking with inspectors. I was 15 when he handed me a shovel and explained why every pipe, every cleanout, and every access lid had to remain reachable. At the time, I thought it was just another lesson about hard work. Years later, I realized he was teaching me something much bigger. Good construction always respects the future. Every maintenance point exists because someday someone will need it. After my father passed away, The house became more than a place to sleep. Every corner carried a memory. The old pecan tree where we fixed bicycles. The weathered workshop where he taught me how to read blueprints before I could even drive. Even the septic access tucked quietly beside the property line reminded me of long summer afternoons when he explained that invisible systems keep visible lives running. Most neighbors never noticed it because the circular lid sat almost perfectly level with the ground, surrounded by healthy grass. That was exactly how it should have looked. Quiet, functional, forgotten. The neighborhood itself was peaceful for years. Children rode bicycles after school. Dogs barked behind wooden fences. Lawn mowers hummed every Saturday morning like clockwork. Everyone waved when passing each other, even if they barely knew one another's names. Then Derek Collins moved into the house next door. Before I ever met him, I noticed the enormous luxury motorhome parked in his driveway. It gleamed under the Texas sun with polished chrome and tinted windows that reflected the entire street like a mirror. Within a week, contractors delivered decorative stone, stacks of lumber, and landscaping supplies almost every day. Derek clearly enjoyed improving his property, and at first I respected that. Homeownership is personal. Everyone wants to leave a mark. But little things started catching my attention. A survey stake near the property line disappeared. A temporary pile of gravel crept several feet closer to my side of the yard. His delivery trucks occasionally crossed onto my grass instead of backing out carefully. None of it seemed worth starting an argument over, so I simply photographed the changes each time I mowed the lawn. Years of engineering had trained me to document conditions before discussing problems. Measurements settle disagreements far better than opinions ever do. Looking back now, those quiet photographs became the first pages of a story neither of us realized was already beginning to unfold. The first real conversation Derek and I ever had happened on a bright Saturday morning while I was trimming the edge of my lawn. He walked over carrying a cup of coffee, smiled, and introduced himself with the easy confidence of someone who assumed every room would eventually belong to him. He complimented the neighborhood, admired the mature trees, and spent several minutes talking about the luxury motorhome he had finally purchased after years of saving. It was impressive, there was no denying that. Nearly 40 feet long, polished from front to back, and equipped with every feature imaginable. He spoke about it with genuine pride, and I congratulated him because everyone deserves to enjoy the rewards of hard work. Then he looked toward the narrow strip of land between our houses and casually said, "I just wish I had a little more room to park it comfortably." At the time, the sentence sounded harmless. Looking back, it was the first warning I failed to recognize. Over the next 2 weeks, his interest in that section of ground became impossible to ignore. He measured distances with a tape measure while talking on his phone. He walked the property line several times each evening. One afternoon, I noticed him standing directly over the septic access lid, studying it with the same expression an architect might wear before sketching a renovation. He asked what the round cover was for. I explained that it provided maintenance access to the septic system and had to remain unobstructed whenever inspections or pumping were needed. He nodded without asking another question, but something about his silence felt different. It was not curiosity anymore. It was calculation. A few days later, landscaping stakes appeared near his driveway. Then pallets of crushed limestone arrived. Shortly after that came a delivery of asphalt edging materials stacked neatly beside his garage. Every new delivery suggested a larger project taking shape. My engineering instincts immediately noticed something else. None of the temporary layout markings respected the existing property features. They formed a straight path that extended toward the exact area where the septic access sat. I walked outside carrying a copy of my original property survey and compared the dimensions with what I saw in front of me. The measurements did not match. I considered knocking on Derek's door to ask what he was planning, but experience had taught me that assumptions often create bigger conflicts than facts. Instead, I updated my photo records, saved the date on every image, and filed them into a folder on my computer labeled simply Property Line. It was a habit I had developed over years of managing construction projects. Conditions change quickly, but photographs remember everything. The following Friday afternoon, as I returned from work, I noticed bright orange paint marking the edge of the grass only a few feet from the septic access. The paint was fresh enough that I could still smell it in the warm air. Small utility flags fluttered gently in the breeze, outlining what looked suspiciously like the footprint of an expanded parking pad. I stood there for several minutes, listening to birds overhead and distant traffic beyond the subdivision, wondering whether I was overthinking an ordinary home improvement. Deep down, however, another voice reminded me of something my father used to say whenever a blueprint ignored an existing utility line. Problems rarely begin with concrete or asphalt. They begin with someone deciding that rules only apply to other people. Early Monday morning, I heard the deep rumble of diesel engines before I even poured my first cup of coffee. The sound grew louder until it settled directly outside my kitchen window. When I looked through the blinds, 2 dump trucks were backing into Derek's driveway while a paving crew unloaded compact equipment onto the street. Workers moved with practiced efficiency, placing cones, rolling out measuring strings, and preparing the ground as if every detail had already been approved weeks earlier. Fresh gravel crunched beneath heavy tires, and the smell of fuel drifted across the yard with the warm morning breeze. I stepped outside carrying my property survey in one hand. Derek spotted me immediately, waved with complete confidence, and walked over wearing reflective sunglasses and a bright smile. "Finally getting this parking pad finished," he said proudly. "That motorhome deserves something better than plain concrete." I glanced toward the layout strings stretched across the ground and immediately recognized what they revealed. The planned asphalt extension was heading straight toward the section of my yard where the septic access sat hidden beneath the grass. I calmly unfolded my survey and pointed toward the property line. "That area cannot be covered," I explained. "There is protected maintenance access underneath. If the system ever needs service, it has to remain open." Derek barely looked at the document. Instead, he shrugged and answered, "It is only a little round cover. Nobody is ever going to dig that up." His words were casual, almost amused, as though years of engineering standards could be dismissed with a smile. I resisted the temptation to argue. Construction sites reward facts, not emotions. I asked to speak with the paving foreman instead. The foreman walked over, wiped dust from his gloves, and listened politely while I explained my concern. He admitted he was simply following the dimensions marked by the customer and suggested I resolve the property question with Derek before the asphalt truck arrived. It was a reasonable response. Contractors build what they are hired to build. Determining legal boundaries is not their responsibility. I thanked him, stepped back, and began taking photographs from multiple angles. Every survey stake, every painted line, every measurement string, every piece of equipment entering the driveway. Derek noticed my phone and laughed quietly. "Planning to make a scrapbook?" he asked. I simply smiled and continued documenting the site. Less than 30 minutes later, the asphalt truck rolled slowly into position. Steam rose from the fresh mix as workers spread it across the prepared base with smooth, coordinated movements. The sharp smell of hot asphalt filled the air while the vibrating roller compressed each pass into a perfectly flat surface. Inch by inch, the black pavement advanced until it completely covered the grassy area where the septic access had quietly remained for decades. Derek folded his arms with obvious satisfaction as the final roller passed over the surface. Then he turned toward me and delivered the sentence that would echo in my mind for days. "You will never need that ugly patch again." I looked at the flawless new pavement, then at the photographs stored safely on my phone, and quietly slipped the property survey back into its folder. He believed the project had just ended. I knew it had only reached the point where every important fact had finally been preserved. The next morning, I called the county code enforcement office before leaving for work. I was careful with every word because I had learned long ago that emotional complaints rarely produce useful results. I explained that a recently completed paving project appeared to block required access to an existing septic system. The employee on the phone listened patiently, took down the property address, and promised that an inspector would review the situation when someone became available. There was no urgency in the response, and I understood why. From their perspective, it sounded like another disagreement between neighbors. By late afternoon, a county inspector arrived and spent several minutes walking around Derek's new parking pad. I stood nearby with my property survey, photographs, and maintenance records neatly organized inside a folder. Derek walked outside carrying what looked like a permit packet and greeted the inspector with complete confidence. He explained that he had hired licensed contractors, obtained approval for driveway improvements, and completed the project according to the plans he had submitted. The inspector compared the paperwork with the visible construction and nodded thoughtfully. Then he turned toward me and said something that was technically accurate but deeply frustrating. Based on what he could immediately verify, the driveway permit itself appeared valid. If there was a dispute involving property rights, utility access, or easements, additional documentation would be required before the county could take further action. It was not the answer I wanted, but it was not a rejection either. It simply meant the visible pavement told only part of the story. Derek could barely hide his satisfaction. As soon as the inspector drove away, he smiled and spread his hands as if the matter had already been settled forever. "Looks like everything checks out," he said. "I told you this was not a problem." I simply thanked the inspector for his time and walked back inside without responding to Derek's celebration. Some victories only exist because people stop looking too early. That evening, I opened the filing cabinet in my home office where my father had stored decades of property documents. Large manila folders filled one drawer, each carefully labeled in his neat handwriting. Original survey, septic installation, county permits, utility correspondence, maintenance records. I slowly spread everything across my desk, reading each page under the warm light of an old brass lamp that had once belonged to him. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its usual evening rhythm. Lawn sprinklers clicked across nearby yards. Crickets began singing after sunset. Every ordinary sound reminded me that solving this problem would require patience instead of frustration. Around 9 o'clock, I found a folded engineering drawing tucked inside a weathered envelope. It was older than I remembered, and the edges had turned slightly yellow with age. A handwritten note in my father's handwriting pointed toward the septic access location with a simple reminder: "Keep this clear for service." That sentence stayed with me as I continued searching through the remaining documents. The county inspector had not said I was wrong. He had simply said I had not yet provided enough proof. Those are two very different things. As I organized every survey, permit, and maintenance record into chronological order, I realized I was no longer trying to win an argument with my neighbor. I was preparing to let the facts tell a complete story, one document at a time. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to the county records office just after it opened. The building smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee, the kind of place where decades of property history quietly waited inside filing cabinets instead of headlines. I requested every document connected to my address, including the original subdivision plat, septic installation permit, utility records, and archived engineering drawings. The clerk disappeared into a back room and returned 20 minutes later with a thick stack of folders that looked as though they had not been opened in years. As I carefully turned each page, familiar survey symbols and handwritten inspection notes slowly began fitting together like pieces of a blueprint. Then I found exactly what I had been hoping for. Attached to the original septic approval was a county engineering memorandum stating that permanent access to the service lid had to remain unobstructed for inspection, maintenance, and emergency repairs. The wording was simple, but it carried legal weight because it had been incorporated into the approved site plan when the property was first developed. A second document referenced a recorded utility easement that crossed the same section of ground now buried beneath fresh asphalt. I asked the clerk to make certified copies of every relevant page before leaving the office with a folder that was considerably heavier than when I arrived. On my way home, I stopped by the engineering firm where an old colleague, Michael Harper, now worked as a licensed land surveyor. Michael had spent nearly 20 years resolving boundary disputes throughout the county, and I trusted both his experience and his attention to detail. Without offering an opinion, I simply handed him the certified records and asked whether he would independently verify the existing conditions. 2 days later, he met me at the property carrying professional survey equipment. The morning air was cool, and the neighborhood remained unusually quiet except for birds calling from the oak trees overhead. Michael carefully established control points, checked the recorded property corners, and compared every measurement against the original subdivision map. He worked methodically, saying very little until the final calculations appeared on his data collector. Then he looked up, pointed toward the newly paved parking pad, and calmly said, "The recorded access area extends directly beneath this section." Hearing those words from an independent surveyor mattered far more than hearing them from myself. I already believed the records. Now another licensed professional had confirmed them. Before leaving, Michael prepared a signed field sketch showing the exact relationship between the property line, the utility easement, the septic access, and the new pavement. That afternoon, I added his survey, the certified county documents, my dated photographs, and the maintenance records into a single organized binder with labeled tabs. Every page supported the next one. Every photograph matched a drawing. Every drawing matched an official record. There were no assumptions left, only evidence arranged in the order that told the clearest possible story. Sitting at my desk that evening, I quietly closed the binder and realized the balance had finally shifted. Derek still believed he had won because he could see fresh asphalt. I knew something he could not yet see. The strongest foundation in any legal dispute is not concrete. It is documentation that leaves no room for doubt. The following morning, I did not call Derek, and I did not walk next door. There was nothing left to debate. Every important fact now existed on paper, signed by people whose job was to measure reality instead of opinions. My next step was simply to place those facts in front of the right people. I contacted an attorney who specialized in real estate and property access disputes. After reviewing the survey, the certified county records, and the engineering memorandum, she closed the binder, smiled slightly, and said, "This is one of the most organized files I have seen in years." She explained that emotion would not decide what happened next. Documentation would. That afternoon, she prepared a formal demand letter requesting immediate removal of the obstruction, restoration of the protected access area, reimbursement for professional inspections, and confirmation that future maintenance access would remain unobstructed. Every supporting document was attached in chronological order. There were no accusations, no dramatic language, and no personal attacks. Just dates, measurements, photographs, signatures, and county records. The letter was delivered by certified mail the next morning. 2 days passed without a response. On the third day, Derek finally knocked on my front door. His confidence had changed, although he tried not to show it. He held the envelope in one hand and asked whether I was seriously planning to involve attorneys over what he called a little paving project. I calmly invited him to look at the survey that Michael had prepared. He glanced at the drawing for only a few seconds before pushing it back across the table. "My contractor said everything was fine," he replied. I simply answered, "Your contractor built what you requested." He did not determine what the county records protect. Derek insisted that the driveway permit proved he had done nothing wrong. I explained that a driveway permit approved the construction itself. It did not erase recorded easements, remove maintenance requirements, or authorize anyone to block protected infrastructure on another property. He shook his head, thanked me for my time, and walked away convinced that I was overreacting. I watched him leave without another word. That same afternoon, my attorney submitted the complete documentation package to the county office responsible for utility access compliance, along with the independent survey and certified engineering records. Within 48 hours, the county scheduled an on-site inspection involving both the property records department and an infrastructure compliance inspector. Unlike the first visit, this inspection was based on verified documentation instead of visible appearances alone. I spent the evening before the inspection quietly organizing the original photographs on my laptop, making sure every image matched its corresponding survey reference. Outside, Derek's motorhome sat proudly on the smooth black pavement, exactly where he wanted it. The polished exterior reflected the evening sunlight as though nothing could possibly change. Looking through my office window, I realized the entire dispute had reached a point where neither Derek nor I controlled the outcome anymore. The measurements had been verified. The records had been certified. The evidence had been submitted. All that remained was for the county to compare the documents with the pavement that now covered something it was never supposed to hide. Sometimes the strongest move is not making another move at all. Sometimes justice begins the moment every fact has finally been placed exactly where it belongs. The county inspection began just after 8 o'clock on Thursday morning. 2 county vehicles pulled onto the street, followed by Michael's survey truck. The same inspector who had visited earlier stepped out carrying a thicker folder than before. This time, he was not relying on what could be seen from the sidewalk. Every certified record, survey, engineering memorandum, maintenance requirement, and photograph had already been reviewed before he arrived. The inspection was simply the final comparison between the official documents and the physical conditions on the property. Derek walked outside looking confident at first, convinced that his driveway permit would settle everything once again. He greeted the inspector with the same easy smile I had seen all week, but the atmosphere felt different. Nobody began with conversation. Instead, the surveyor carefully located the recorded property corners and stretched measuring tape across the driveway. Every measurement matched the field sketch Michael had prepared. The inspector compared the numbers against the certified county drawings, nodded quietly, and continued marking locations with small paint dots across the fresh asphalt. After several minutes, he stopped directly above the section where the buried septic access was supposed to be. He looked at Derek and spoke in the calm, steady voice of someone explaining facts rather than opinions. The paved surface was covering protected maintenance access identified in the original approved engineering documents. The recorded utility easement required unobstructed access for inspection, maintenance, and emergency service. A driveway permit did not authorize permanent obstruction of protected infrastructure. Derek immediately pointed toward the permit packet he had shown during the first inspection and insisted that licensed contractors had completed the project exactly as requested. The inspector acknowledged that point without disagreement. Then he explained the distinction that changed everything. The permit approved the paving work itself. It did not remove previously recorded property obligations or invalidate engineering requirements attached to the original development of the lot. Those obligations remained enforceable regardless of later improvements. For the first time since this entire situation began, Derek had no immediate response. He looked from the survey stakes to the painted reference marks, and then back toward the smooth black parking pad beneath his motorhome. The silence lasted several long seconds before the inspector handed him a formal compliance notice. The document required removal of the obstructing pavement, restoration of access to the septic system, verification by a licensed inspector after completion, and correction within the specified compliance period. Failure to comply could result in additional enforcement action. Derek slowly lowered the paperwork and quietly asked whether there was another solution. The inspector answered honestly. If the access had remained unobstructed, there would have been no issue. Now the only acceptable correction was restoring the condition required by the recorded documents. As the county vehicles pulled away later that morning, I remained standing near my mailbox, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood returning once again. Lawn sprinklers clicked across nearby yards. A delivery truck rolled slowly down the street. Birds settled into the branches above my driveway. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nobody had shouted. Nobody had celebrated. Yet everything had changed. The decision was no longer based on opinions, assumptions, or competing arguments. It rested entirely on measurements, records, and engineering standards that had existed long before either Derek or I ever owned our homes. Watching him quietly read the compliance notice one more time, I realized the hardest part of the journey was finally over. From that moment forward, the law itself would finish the work that the evidence had already begun. 3 days after the compliance notice was issued, the same street that had smelled like fresh asphalt was filled with the sharp scent of concrete dust and diesel exhaust. A demolition crew arrived just after sunrise, parked their equipment beside Derek's driveway, and began cutting long, precise lines through the pavement that had looked so permanent only days before. The steady scream of the concrete saw echoed across the neighborhood, while small clouds of dust drifted into the morning air. One by one, heavy slabs of asphalt were lifted away, exposing the compacted gravel underneath. Then, just as the county survey had predicted, the round green septic access lid appeared exactly where every document said it would be. The inspector returned to verify the restoration, checked the exposed access point, and signed the final inspection report without unnecessary ceremony. After the damaged area was cleaned, a licensed septic contractor inspected the system and confirmed that no structural damage had occurred beneath the surface. The relief I felt in that moment had very little to do with winning a dispute. It came from knowing that something my father had built with care decades earlier had been protected exactly the way he intended. The final invoices arrived over the following week. Asphalt demolition, site restoration, professional surveying, engineering verification, septic inspection, legal fees, administrative costs. By the time every required correction had been completed, The total exceeded $16,000. Derek never argued about the amount. The documents were too clear, the inspections too complete, and the process too thoroughly recorded. A few days later, I saw him standing quietly beside the restored area while a landscaping crew spread fresh topsoil and planted new grass seed where the pavement had once been. He looked over at me as I collected my mail and gave a small nod. It was not an apology, but it was the first moment since we became neighbors that I saw genuine humility instead of confidence. I returned the nod and continued walking inside. There was nothing left to prove. The paperwork had already done that. As summer slowly turned toward fall, the neighborhood settled back into its familiar rhythm. Children rode bicycles after school. Lawn mowers hummed on Saturday mornings. The motorhome now rested entirely within Derek's own driveway, and the strip of grass above the septic access blended naturally into the yard once again. If someone drove past our homes for the first time, they would never guess that months of surveys, engineering records, inspections, and legal documents had all centered around that quiet patch of ground. Sometimes the most important places on a property are the ones nobody notices until they disappear. Every time I mow the lawn now, I pass over that restored access lid and remember something my father told me all those years ago. Good construction is never just about what people can see. It is about respecting what lies beneath the surface and understanding that every part of a property was designed with a purpose. Derek believed he had created the perfect parking space by covering an empty piece of ground. What he actually covered was a protected access point backed by decades of engineering standards, county records, and legal requirements. In the end, the asphalt was removed, the access was restored, and the facts remained exactly where they had always been. Justice was never delivered through anger or revenge. It arrived through measurements, documentation, patience, and the simple truth that the strongest foundation is not poured with concrete. It is built with integrity.